Welcome to This Explainer. I'm Alpha, and I'm here with my colleague Beta. Today, we are diving deep into the hidden mechanics of rhetorical arguments. Whenever a speaker tries to persuade you, they're actually relying on these unseen cognitive structures to silently guide your logic. Our goal today is to deconstruct these structures, specifically the classical enthymeme, and give you a rock-solid, definitive framework for rhetorical analysis.
That's right, Alpha. We're going to break this down so you can see exactly how these arguments work under the hood.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First up, we'll cover the theoretical foundations and the rule of brevity. Second, we'll look at the cognitive mechanics, basically, authentic persuasion versus manipulation. Third, we'll walk you through a strict three-step analytical framework. And finally, we'll wrap up with some applied secular case studies. All right, let's jump right into part one, theoretical foundations and the rule of brevity. To really build that foundation, Beta, we've got to start with the Aristotelian concept of the enthymeme. Aristotle defined it fundamentally as a rhetorical syllogism. Actually, scratch that. It's not just a syllogism, it's literally the very substance of rhetorical persuasion.
Exactly. And crucially, these arguments don't deal with absolute scientific certainties. We're not talking about math or physics here. Instead, they target contingent matters, human actions, everyday decisions, policies where alternative outcomes are entirely possible. Plus, they're specifically designed for an audience of what Aristotle called untrained thinkers. Basically, everyday people who might, frankly, struggle to follow a dense, extended chain of formal academic logic.
Right, and because the enthymeme targets that specific audience, it's governed by what we call the brevity rule. To keep people engaged, an enthymeme intentionally condenses its logic. It actively omits structural propositions or familiar facts that a standard formal syllogism would rigidly require. The whole strategy here is efficiency. If a piece of information is already a widely accepted truth in society, well, the speaker just completely suppresses it. They fully expect the listener to silently add it in themselves. Now, to spot these abbreviated proofs out in the wild, analysts look for specific linguistic anchors. When you're evaluating discourse, you want to scan for explicit textual connectives. We're talking about really common markers, words like for, because, therefore, and since.
Yeah, these connectives act like visible hinges in the text. They signal that a conclusion is being tethered to a stated premise, while deliberately leaving that major, overarching premise totally unspoken.
Moving right along to part two, cognitive mechanics. Let's talk about persuasion versus deception. So the true power of the enthymeme actually lies in its cognitive effect. Authentic persuasion relies on a fascinating phenomenon called intelligent anticipation. When a speaker purposely omits a self-evident premise, the audience actually experiences this lively cognitive pleasure in mentally supplying that missing link. It's like solving a mini puzzle. The listener effectively co-authors the conclusion, which makes the argument incredibly compelling and memorable. But, and this is a huge but, spurious deception weaponizes this exact same cognitive loophole. It uses manipulative structures that mimic valid proofs, basically tricking the audience into supplying false premises to bridge those illogical gaps. Let's dissect those manipulative tactics for a second. You're often going to see the fallacy of omission. That involves leaving out vital contexts of time or circumstance to deceitfully frame a complex probability as an absolute, undeniable truth. Then there's the weaponization of an isolated sign. That's when a speaker claims an entire, unproven category must be true just because one specific trait exists. Oh, and finally, watch out for indignant or alarmist language. This paints a highly colored emotional picture that bypasses rational scrutiny altogether. It essentially forces the audience to infer guilt or absolute necessity based purely on the speaker's artificial passion. All right, let's get into part three, the analytical framework. This is our core three-step method. This method requires three strict, systematic steps. Step one is identification. That means spotting the rhetorical proof by isolating those textual connectives we mentioned, and then defining the contingent domain. Alpha, step two is reconstruction. Here, you're pulling back the curtain on the brevity rule. You expand that abbreviated text into a formal three-part syllogism. Basically, you isolate the stated conclusion, grab the stated premise, and then, here's the fun part, expose that suppressed premise hiding in the background. And step three is evaluation. This is where you analyze the fundamental structure and the strategic delivery of the complete argument. Right, and during that final evaluation step, you're measuring the argument against some very specific metrics. First, what's its structural basis? Is it built on probability, meaning what usually happens, or is it built on a sign, meaning specific, isolated evidence?
Next, you determine the strategic objective. Is it demonstrative, as in seeking to prove a point by joining compatible statements together? Or is it refutative? Aristotle actually noted that refutative enthymemes are exceptionally effective because they put opposing arguments side by side. It just makes the logic starkly clear.
And finally, you evaluate the stylistic delivery. Notice if techniques like antithesis or metaphor are being used to make the logic feel more active and punchy. Okay, it's time to put this into practice. Let's move to Part 4, Secular Case Studies, our applied analysis. Let's look at a classic example of political rhetoric regarding national security. The statement goes like this: we must increase our national defense budget this fiscal year because our geopolitical adversaries are actively modernizing their cyber warfare capabilities.
Okay, so the linguistic anchor here is the word because. That immediately signals that a rhetorical proof is being deployed. Alpha, let's map this one out.
You got it. Let's reconstruct the logic. The explicit stated conclusion is that we must increase the national defense budget. The explicit stated premise supporting this is that adversaries are modernizing their cyber capabilities. But when we expand this abbreviated text into a formal syllogism, we reveal this massive unstated assumption bridging the two. The suppressed premise here is the assumption that financial budget increases are the absolutely only viable strategic response to cyber threats. The speaker requires you, the audience, to silently supply this premise to make the whole argument function. Exactly, and evaluating this reconstructed logic exposes a manipulative structural tactic, the fallacy of omission. The speaker has deceitfully framed a complex probability as an absolute necessity.
Right. By omitting vital context, they hide alternative strategic options. Things like reallocating existing funds, maybe pursuing diplomatic treaties, or modifying current cyber protocols. All of that gets hidden behind a simple, urgent funding binary. The intelligent anticipation of the audience is literally being exploited here to bypass a comprehensive policy debate.
Now, let's shift gears and focus on corporate branding and consumer advertising. Consider this copy. Switch to the Horizon electric vehicle today. Protect your children's future. Beta, notice anything? The explicit connective word is actually missing here. But that side-by-side positioning creates an implicit imperative sequence. So reconstructing this implicit sequence visually separates the explicit emotional appeal from the hidden illogical leap. The stated conclusion is the directive, switch to the Horizon EV. The stated premise driving this is the desire to protect your children's future.
And the suppressed premise? It's the massive, totally unstated assumption linking a consumer purchase to global environmental safety. It's the idea that buying this one specific commercial vehicle guarantees the protection of your children's future.
When we evaluate this, we are looking at a textbook example of spurious deception. This advertisement completely weaponizes an isolated sign.
Yeah, it takes one single data point, maybe the lower localized emissions of an EV, and uses it to completely bypass rational consumer scrutiny about, say, manufacturing impact, battery disposal, or even alternative public transit. It uses the cognitive shortcut of the Enthymeme to turn a standard commercial transaction into a binding act of moral duty. It's pure manipulation of the audience's protective instincts.
So, by strictly applying this three-step framework of identification, reconstruction, and evaluation, analysts can strip the rhetorical camouflage off of any text. You expose the underlying logic, or honestly, the lack thereof. And that brings us to a final, crucial point of reflection to end our explainer today. If our most compelling beliefs rely on premises that we silently supply ourselves, what unstated assumptions are governing your decisions today?